to the Gospel of Matthew, all of us know that this is the first Gospel as laid out in the New Testament canon. And all this while, when we have been studying the Gospel of Mark, we have been, we are enlightened about the fact that in the canon, in fact, the Gospel of Mark was the first text of a Gospel account that was written. And today, entire NT scholarship more or less has come to the consensus with a term called the Markan priority. So when we talk about Markan priority, we presume that Mark's was the first Gospel that was in circulation amongst the early Christian communities. And from the Gospel of Mark, which is a primary source, Matthew and Luke seem to have, drawn their own gospel accounts, but not only depending on what has been, been in the Gospel of Mark, but they have also used another source. I request.
Excuse me, Sylvie. I can hear you, but I cannot see the screen.
Can't see the screen?
No, it's not on.
What about the others?
No, we can see. I can see, ma'am.
We can see.
Now I got it.
Now you can see me, na?
Yeah,
Okay.
now I can.
Okay. So besides the material from the Gospel of Mark, we know that Matthew and Luke also have a huge amount of common material between the two evangelists. So from that, scholars and the biblical scholarship world has come to the conclusion that there was a common source which we are already very familiar with because we have studied it when we were doing the Gospel of Mark, and that is the Q source, okay, the silent source from the Quelle source, which is supposed to be the saints' gospel, but we have no copy of the Q gospel in the world as of today. It is a hypothetical source in the sense that we are imagining, because of the commonality of the material in Matthew and Luke, we know that they must have drawn that material from some common source, and that is why that source is called the Quelle source. The meaning of Quelle in German means source itself. Sometimes it is also given the meaning of being silent or silent source. Okay, so we know that Matthew, when he drew his gospel, whoever the evangelist might be, as we'll be going through the sessions, we will be looking into location, where it was written, to whom it was written, and eventually who was actually the writer of this gospel. Traditionally, the church has always been, telling us, as per church tradition, it is the Apostle Matthew who is the author behind the canonical text of the Gospel of Mark, as we see in the New Testament canon. Matthew has always been the most preferred, and not only he, being the apostle, is considered to be the evangelist behind the text of canonical Matthew, but in the church, right from the beginning, the early church, of course, we know that when the church in Rome, we cannot actually, when we talk about church, it is not the concept that we have of church today. We imagine, when we talk about church, we imagine huge communities that congregate together, maybe on Sundays and, for other moments of worship. At that point of time, when Christianity, in fact, that movement, Jesus movement, was not even given the term Christianity. The self-understanding of the members of the community was not that they were Christians. They always felt that they were part of the Jewish community, because basically the first Christians were all Jewish Christians. So in that milieu of the first nascent early church, Mark's gospel was already in circulation, but as the centuries went on, as decades went on, turned into centuries, the first church fathers, they showed a special predilection, a sort of a liking for the Gospel of Matthew, and there's a reason behind it, and that is why when the canon was assembled, the New Testament canon, we know, it was finalized in the sense there was no sort of, an ecumenical council of the church and all, which passed a sort of a decree that this is the canon and it is final. Nothing of that sort happened. But over the first 2 or 3 centuries, when, this very highly intellectual bishop Athanasius from Alexandria. He was a primary mover who assembled all the things together. We have gone through all these things when we are studying the Gospel of Mark, but it will be a good thing if we revise those things again. So when he was assembling, he was the one who collected only certain texts of the Gospel, because remember, at this point of time, there were many other texts in circulation. We have only 4 Gospel accounts, but does it mean that there were only 4 written Gospels? Not at all. We know there were, a series of texts that were being written by the early Christians, but not everything entered the canon, because some of them ended up being very spurious and all. And that is why the word canon means, the actual meaning of the word canon means a measuring rod, something, like the plumb line that we use during construction. So canon basically means a sort of a rule according to which only certain things, certain text will be admitted as scripture and certain text will not. So when this canon, it was through a letter, Bishop Athanasius, he was a very prolific writer and used to write lots of letters to all his communities. He was a bishop of Alexandria, and the Alexandrian community was quite a flourishing community. It was one of the best Christian centers that we had. It was in Egypt. So in his 39th festal letters, those letters are also called festal letters because he used to give a lot of his own commentary and all on some of the writings of the Old Testament, sometimes of the New Testament text, whatever were considered to be authoritative. And through that festal letter in the year 367, he proposed that list of 27 books. And that's how from that time onwards we know that in our New Testament, what we see today, it has 27 books. And whatever denominations of Christianity we might belong to, whether we are Catholics, whether we belong to the Orthodox Church, whether we belong to the Protestant church or whatever, the books in the NT remain the same, 27, except for a few churches, okay, like the Coptic Church and all, they might have a few letters here and there extra. But universally speaking, among the Christians, it is the 27 texts that make up the NT corpus of the New Testament. So when these church fathers, when we go through all the patristic records means all the writings of the early church fathers put together. It's a very rich corpus that we have in the Christian tradition. So they always showed a very special preference for the Gospel of Matthew, though Mark was already there in circulation for a reason. And when you look at the earliest codices, what's a codex? Codices is a plural form of a codex. A codex is, in the past we used to have the biblical scrolls. A scroll could be at the most around only 30 feet long, not more than that. So scrolls used to be very lengthy in writing. So, the Christians, in fact, were the first ones who devised this clever way of putting all the papyrus together in a sort of a book form. So when we talk of a codex is nothing but a precursor to the modern book that we have, how the leaves are all bound together. So that was actually something that emerged from the Christian communities. So when we talk of the earliest codices, okay, the Codex Sinaiticus is supposed to be the oldest one. Even the others, the Leningrad Codex and Codex Bezae and all, there are different names for them. There are copies of the NT. So when you look at all these codices, you will always find Matthew placed first. So Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, this is the sequence, this is the order which from ancient times onwards till today, it is supposed to be the final authoritative version of the New Testament canon. So Matthew was the most preferred gospel in the early church because there were reasons for it. It was considered to be complete and authoritative, presenting Jesus as the promised Messiah who fulfilled OT prophecies. Most important is complete. Now when we look at Mark's gospel and when you compare the text of Matthew's gospel, what is a difference between these two gospel accounts? The gospel account of Mark will not tell you anything about the birth of Jesus. Whereas when you look in the gospel account of Matthew and later on also Luke, we will always find that the gospel begins with the infancy narratives. The first two chapters of the Gospel of Mark, it will tell you the birth stories of Jesus. But Mark's Gospel, because there is each of these four evangelists, they also have a very unique theological outlook. Though they tell, a biography of Jesus, they are telling us about the life and mission of Jesus, each of them give us a special spin to the account that they give depending on what exactly is their theological outlook. So to hear for Matthew, when he is writing about the birth stories, there's a reason behind it. And so because the birth stories are there, passion narratives are there in all the four gospels. So to that account, all the gospels would be considered complete. But when you look at Mark and compare it to Luke and Matthew, because the birth narratives are not there in the Gospel of Mark, the ancient fathers, they felt that somehow there was something lacking in the Gospel of Mark. Mark is a very sort of a racing, very dramatic narrative, because for Mark, what he wanted to present to the people, to his community especially, the church in Rome, it was a persecuted community. It was a suffering church in Rome. So he wanted to put before his audience, his community, his house church, that Jesus is the suffering Messiah. He is ultimately the Son of God. He begins only his gospel directly making the proclamation, the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. And then you have, Jesus' baptism. So with that begins the Gospel of Mark, but not Matthew. Matthew has a purpose, okay? So for that reason, because he has included the birth narrative, the infancy narrative in his Gospel, just like Luke, it was considered to be complete and authoritative. Why? Because the teachings, the teachings are mostly drawn from the Q source, the Quelle, the saints gospel, which today we have no copy of it, extant is not there at all. But from there, the teachings, the saints of Jesus means basically the revelations and the teachings that Jesus imparted to the people. They were all collected together, and those he has very brilliantly put, in a very systematic 5 discourse part of the gospel. So if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, it is a brilliant piece of writing, because Matthew has taken the trouble to organize his material with a theological intent in his mind. And authoritative, why the church fathers felt that Gospel of Matthew is very authoritative, because if you look through the text of the Gospel of Matthew, you realize that he is presenting Jesus as an authoritative teacher. Actually, he is presenting Jesus as a new Moses, and not only as a new Moses, somebody who supplants the teaching of Moses. And that is why it was considered to be complete and authoritative, and that was the reason the Gospel of Matthew was given this primary place in the anti-canon by being placed first. Key reasons for its popularity. Copies of this papyrus text and all, so for circulation, because you needed scribes to copy them, so it used to be a very tedious sort of work. So it was orally, the text of the gospel used to be like how we have today in our church. in the church, when we have during the mass, we have an ordered liturgy wherein the word of God plays a very central role. It is the spine of the entire liturgical celebration. So too, this text of the gospel, be it Mark and Matthew, and later on Luke comes much later, they were used in the gospel communities for worship and prayer. Okay, so because the way Matthew has structured and organized all his material in a very comprehensive manner, it became, a very great tool and an instrument for teaching the lay faithful in the church communities. Emphasis in the gospel on Jesus as Son of God. Okay, Matthew emphasizes, just like the other evangelist also, Matthew emphasizes the birth of Jesus, and he is very emphatic to make this proclamation that Jesus is the Son of God, and emphasizes Jesus' divine nature from the very beginning, from the starting of his birth. Okay, so his birth also is considered to be miraculous. Okay, so the announcement of the angel and all those things, all are pulled together in the narrative in order to show that Jesus' birth, okay, his coming into the world, was part of God's larger salvific plan, not only for Israel but for the whole world. And finally, the connection to Davidic lineage. Remember that the Jewish people, it was given in the book of Samuel that David's dynasty, God had promised David that his dynasty would remain forever. The Davidic king, okay, the kingship of David would never end. So that belief was always factored into the belief of the coming Messiah, that the coming Messiah would be not only the suffering Messiah, which is an understanding which Jesus highlights very beautifully, but he was also, according to the religious sentiments of the Jewish people, he would be David's son. So Matthew brings this out very beautifully by connecting Jesus to Israel's royal lineage, which was a key expectation for the Messiah. And that is the reason we have the genealogy of Jesus. Remember the beginning of the gospel, you have okay, this one son, that one son. You have that entire running sequel of the lineage. Finally, going back in time, finally he doesn't only connect Jesus to the line of David, to David's kingship, but directly to Abraham, because Matthew is trying to project Jesus not only as the Davidic Messiah, but he is going to be representative of the entire human race, because Abraham is a father of faith, and he is a representative not only of Israel but anybody who believes. So all nations are drawn into Abraham. So he's shown, right, the genealogy will run backwards, showing Jesus not only son of David but also son of Abraham. As I told you, authoritative Gospel of Matthew presents Jesus as very authoritative in the figure. He sort of foreshadows the figure of Moses. Okay, like how Moses was supposed to be a very authoritative teacher for Israel, and the belief among the people was also that prior to the coming of the Messiah, there would be a prophet like Moses. So all these strands are woven in the Gospel of Matthew, and that is the reason it was considered to be very authoritative and facilitated a lot of teaching in the communities. Upholder and supreme interpreter of the Torah. We will see in the Gospel of Matthew very beautifully, he emphasizes that there's one particular key text where Jesus says, "You think I have come to destroy the law, but I have not come to destroy the law, but I have come to keep it." And every word, every letter, okay, of the law will be fulfilled. So what was Jesus trying to tell the people? Many a times we have that misunderstanding that when he was having the clash with the Pharisees and the scribes, he was disputing with them. Why? Because of the way they rigidly interpreted the laws of God. He was not a breaker of the laws of the Pentateuch. He was, in fact, the supreme upholder of the whole thing. We have seen a little bit of that in Mark also, but in the Gospel of Matthew, this comes to a head, especially when we will see those debates that Jesus is intensely engaged in with the Pharisees in chapter 23. And last of all, apostolic authority. The gospel was traditionally attributed to Apostle Matthew. So we do not know. Today's scholars have come to the consensus that the Apostle Matthew may not be the final redactor of the gospel as we see it today. The final canonical text of the Gospel of Matthew, it is said according to Matthew. He may not be the final person, okay, who came out with the final text. Because see, we have to remember that all these gospel accounts, there have been stages of composition. It is not that overnight, one of the evangelists was inspired and just sat down and took, put to writing everything. Not like that. We know in the case of Mark, he was a sort of a secretary to Peter, and Peter used to preach in Rome. Probably also in Antioch earlier before he migrated to Rome. So all of Peter's teachings were gathered together, and it was oral tradition. Through orality, by mouth, the message of Jesus used to be proclaimed and spread around. So Mark had gathered all the sermons. So basically, you have to remember the gospel accounts were sermons, okay, preliminary sermon material that was gathered together, and it was given textual or refurbishing later on by the evangelists. So you initially might be that the Apostle Matthew, being a person, we know that he was a tax collector, so he was the best person, well positioned. He must have been highly educated, because not anybody could be a tax collector, because to be a tax collector you had to qualify, you had to have scribal education, you should have been a person not only able to read but to write, maintain records. So Matthew in that sense was the best person placed, okay, according to his position in society, to be a person who could record the basic teaching of Jesus as he went about in the towns and villages of Galilee and later on in Jerusalem. So Matthew, the Apostle Matthew, being the person who is considered to be the authority behind it, there is apostolic authority automatically that is extended to the text. And this was one of the reasons also that Matthew's gospel was considered to be the primary gospel text which was preferred by the church fathers. Now, is the Apostle Matthew the evangelist behind the canonical gospel of Matthew? When we talk about the canonical gospel is the gospel text that finally made into the canon. So the book of Matthew as we see it today, so that is canonical Matthew. So can we say that it was, definitely can we say, did Matthew anywhere write that I am the writer of this gospel? We have to remember all the four accounts are anonymous accounts. Nowhere any of the evangelists reveal their name. Luke will, tell you the person to whom he is dedicating his work, but nowhere does he write that I am Luke, the writer of this, the gospel account. Luke is credited not only writing with the writing of the gospel, but even Acts, and that is why we always talk about Luke Acts. So none of the gospel accounts we have the writer of the gospel appending his name. They were anonymous, okay, they were anonymous texts, but they were authoritative texts, and the people who were using them to read them in their small communities of worship, they very well knew who was the authority behind it. So is this Apostle Matthew the actual evangelist? Definitely not, but he might have been the person who started the exercise, and probably there must have been an earlier primitive document which normally scholars like to call it proto-Matthew, and based on that, as the decades went on, okay, as the worshipping and all became more structured and organized, okay, and different theological meanings came to be attested to the sayings and the teachings of Jesus, automatically the text also finally went on getting revised. So there are stages in all the gospel accounts that are created. So since the times of the early church fathers, the Apostle Matthew has always been canonically accredited with the authorship of the first gospel. But the final text that we have, it's called redacted text. It is definitely not the Apostle Matthew. It is an entire community. All the Gospels owe their origins probably to, an eyewitness, okay, somebody who has been with Jesus, heard him, seen him, and gathered all the material together, or maybe somebody else who has been with him, like in the case of Mark. We know Peter is an eyewitness. Mark, we do not know for sure whether he was eyewitness, so we don't know whether his testimony is eyewitness, but we know who is the source of his gospel. So here too, Matthew must have gathered some material which was later on developed by the community in which that gospel text, held high esteem. We will be looking, very deeply in the later sessions when we come to authorship of the gospel. Even the title, according to Matthew, Kata Matthew, that is in Greek, because the text was written in Greek. There also there's some sort of controversy. We'll be looking into that. But in Greek, it is called Kata Matthew, means according, the gospel according to Matthew. And these appendixes, okay, this appendages, whatever we would like to say, they were given later on in the 2nd century, not so much in the 1st century. The text was widely known among the Christian communities, and probably through oral culture they knew who are the authorities behind the gospel text. But definite appendix giving the name, the person to that work was done only in the 2nd century. The gospel accounts tell us the following details about the Apostle Matthew. Number one, we know what do the gospel accounts, all the four collectively put together, and basically in Matthew himself, he was a Galilean tax collector, probably stationed on a main trade route near Capernaum, where he would have collected tolls for Herod Antipas from commercial traffic, Herod Antipas being the Tetrarch of Galilee. We have to remember he was a Galilean. He did not come from Jerusalem. And often in the past, people used to have the impression that Galilee was like a backwater. It was very undeveloped. But today, through archaeological evidence and all, we know that Galilee was not, the people in Galilee were not very poor, as collectively that is a picture that is painted. Galilee was a very flourishing fishing center, and a lot of trade was being engaged in, and so much so that there was the Romans being the masters of the land, and they used to have the client kings who used to run the entire province on their behalf. So they were interested only in collecting taxes, and who used to collect the taxes? The client king. So here it was Herod Antipas, who was the Tetrarch of Galilee, since they were positioned here in Galilee, and he was at one of the trade routes who was collecting the taxes. Now when we talk about tax collectors, we know the feeling we get, the impression we get from the gospel accounts were that these group of people, especially men, we never heard about any women tax collectors probably in antiquity. So these men who used to be tax collectors, they were, considered to be, they were looked down upon in contempt. Why? They were not poor, they were quite wealthy or rich, because most of the time they were people who were very corrupt, because they would overtax the populations, okay, the populace, because from that tax that they would gather, okay, they were tax gatherers, they were called sometimes tax farmers. So they would harvest the tax on behalf of their rulers, and part of it, what would they get? They had to keep part of it for themselves. So the more they, taxed the people, the more they were able to appropriate benefits for themselves. So naturally, they became a very sort of a hated lot. The common people came to, detest them, because nobody could escape taxes. And being a fishing community, or whatever fish was brought, a part of it would go as taxes. So Matthew probably being at one of these booths where the tax collection is to happen, at the trade route where all this fishing and all was going on, he must have been a person who was very much hated. And it is precisely here, okay, the call comes to him. And the gospel accounts tell us that he was also called Levi. Okay, he was also called Levi. Luke also gives us another further detail that he was the son of Alphaeus. Now, when Luke is mentioning he was the son of Alphaeus, he's sort of presuming that, the readers know who this Alphaeus was. And probably some scholars do draw a connection because there is among the apostles another one called James, whom we call the brother of the Lord, who's considered to be the brother of Jesus. And he's called James the Lesser. And if you look carefully, okay, amongst the names of the apostles that is listed, James is called the son of Alphaeus. So we do not know whether it was the same Alphaeus, but some scholars do draw the connection and say possibly both of them were brothers, but we cannot be very sure. So having been a tax collector, Matthew the Apostle was undoubtedly best positioned for a role as an official recorder of the events in the life and mission of Jesus. So the very fact that he was the tax collector among this group of 12, okay, he might have been, best positioned to put down, okay, to write down the account because he was an eyewitness. He lived with Jesus probably for 2 or 3 years. We do not know for sure. And so he, up close and personal, he would have been the best person to know what his master was teaching and bearing witness to the life that he actually lived because they lived together in a community. So Luke also mentions that he was the son of Alphaeus, which probably makes it plausible that his father was also in a similar profession. And it was common practice that, whatever trade or profession your father is into, the son would naturally take after that. So if we believe that Alphaeus also probably was a tax collector very early on in life, Matthew must have been trained in this profession that he would ultimately take and give up in order to follow Jesus. And so therefore he must have had a very good education, a very sound education, because he was a person who was trained to keep records. This is the call of Jesus when he is at his booth collecting taxes. You must have heard about him. The Gospels will not tell us in detail how, like the first flowering of the call, blossomed in the mind and heart of Matthew or Levi, whatever we'd like to talk to him. But he must have definitely seen Jesus up and down moving, because Jesus was very active around Capernaum, because that was the headquarters from where he was preaching. So from a distance, there must have been something very beautiful and appealing. And Matthew must have, though he was a person, probably we can say, with quite a lot of wealth, and there must have been some emptiness in his heart, okay, that drew him. He felt magnetically drawn towards the person of Jesus and finally says yes to him and joins him in his mission. So summary of gospel attestations about the apostle, we know these are the things I've just put out there in the slide, whatever I've explained earlier. I'll not go through them again. It is only for you to have it as a glance. Matthew's biography in scripture, okay? Where does scripture mention to us about Matthew? These are the texts I've put. We know in Matthew chapter 10, verse 2, 3 and 4, we know here he's mentioned that Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus, and look at, how like collectively they are put one after another. So that is the reason some of the scholars draw the conclusion that probably both of them were brothers. But most of the scholarship today will tell you that James was the brother of Jesus. So this was another James, we are not very sure, because there was another James who was already the brother of John, the son of Zebedee. Again, we find a mention of Matthew's name in the Acts of the Apostle, Luke's account in chapter 1, verses 12 to here. We see Matthew's name here. When they were all, praying for the coming of the Holy Spirit, they were in the cenacle in the company of Mother of Jesus, with Mary, the Mother of Jesus, and with his brothers and the rest of the apostles. And there also Matthew is named. So in two places we find the name of Matthew. So what we know about the man? We know that he was a tax collector, a trained scribe. So he had scribal education. So he knew how to draw text, how to read, how to write. And he was also called Levi, later named Matthew, probably by Jesus, we are not very sure, because Jesus had the habit of naming his friends. Peter also was a name that Jesus gave to Simon. His name was Simon, not Peter. Son of Alphaeus, as was James the Lesser. So probably could have been, we know that brother of James is cousin of our Lord through Alphaeus. So probably this Alphaeus, some of the scholars surmise that this is the same name as Cleophas, but we are not very sure. And Cleophas is supposed to be the brother of Saint Joseph, father of Jesus. So there might be some kinship relationship among them. Strong similarities, they point out that there are strong similarities between the Gospel of Matthew and the Epistle of James. The letter of James, James the Just, he was also called James the Lesser, the brother of the Lord. But some of them feel that there are some similarities, but those are just theological similarities which are, common to all the Gospels and all the writings of the New Testament. In patristic tradition, that is the tradition of the Church Fathers, they place his apostolic ministry in the Caucasus and Persia. Caucasus is the place in Eastern Europe, but we are not very sure because after the resurrection, we don't hear Matthew's name anywhere in the New Testament corpus. And so tradition tells us there were lots of traditions that were gathered, about the apostles. One of them, we know for sure that Saint Thomas also had come to India, and we know that Saint Thomas was martyred here in India. We have his tomb there in Mylapore. Similarly, Nathaniel is also supposed to have come to India, North India. So much so has, there are archaeological proofs. There are textual evidences also to suggest that probably Nathaniel, whom we call Bartholomew, had probably even come down to Kalyan, place very close to Bombay. But all this is shrouded in mystery, so we cannot, historically be very sure about this. But this is what we know about the Apostle Matthew. About the evangelist, we will be analyzing in greater detail who possibly was the final person who put the entire text material together. Now, going to the general analysis of the Gospel of Matthew. If you look at the Gospel of Matthew, it is around 18,300 words long in the Greek language. It is supposed to be originally written in Greek language. There is a little bit of controversy about that also, but more or less today we know that originally Matthew did write in the Greek language only. So when you look at the original text of Matthew, what we hold to be canonical Matthew, it is around 18,300 words long. Compared to that, how long is Mark? Mark is around 11,300 words. Okay, that means it is 50% longer than Mark. But remember that Matthew has written out from Mark. In fact, he has actually repurposed the whole of Mark. Okay, most of Mark, almost 90 to 93% of Mark is embedded in the Gospel of Matthew. The longer length of the Gospel of Matthew is due to the additional material from Q, the saint's material, the saint's source, which is not there at all in Mark, around which Matthew arranges his 5 long discourses and his special material. So Matthew, when he was writing his text, or when the text material was being gathered into the final text, we know for sure 3 sources from which Matthew wrote out. One is Mark as the primary source, second is the Saint's Gospel, the Q source, and besides that, there is special material which is unique only to Matthew, which you will not find either in the Gospel of Mark or in the Gospel of Luke. When we are making these comparisons, remember, we are making the comparisons only among the synoptics. Remember, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are considered to be the synoptic Gospel because there is an interdependence of textual material. There is a relationship between these three Gospel accounts. John's Gospel is only totally separate text which has no interdependence on any of these three, and that is why we know that three sources were from where Matthew drew up and wove his entire textual material, making the canonical Matthew. Only two non-Markan healing miracle stories. He's taken practically almost everything of Mark and reworked it and taken in Q and his special material. And the healing stories are entirely, they are sort of, imported from Mark's gospel and embedded into his text. Except for two miracle stories, which are they? One is the centurion servant boy. Remember, that is a very, very well spelled out healing story in the Gospel of Matthew. So this healing of the centurion servant and the healing of the blind and mute demoniac, these are drawn from Q. They are not taken from Mark. Otherwise, the entire healing corpus from Mark's Gospel is embedded in Matthew. So thus, Mark reproduces more than 80%, according to Raymond Brown. He says 80% of the Greek text. But remember, those texts have been translated. So if you compare the English translations, then it almost roughly comes to around 90 to 93%. So 80% of Mark from the original Greek text is borrowed by Matthew. So Matthew's account of Jesus' public ministry is placed between the infancy narratives and the passion narratives. Okay, those 5 discourses. Continuing with that, the most outstanding feature of this gospel account is a pattern of 5 long discourses or sermons, and it is only Matthew which shows his great organizational skill as a writer, how he has ordered and organized this material which has served the church right from ancient times. And this ordering of these 5 long discourses, all these 5 sermons, including Sermon on the Mount is one of them, the most important one, in which the 8 Beatitudes are embodied. All these 5 discourses are all the teachings of Jesus, and that is the reason the church fathers felt that Matthew's gospel was not only complete, it was authoritative, because Jesus comes out in very flying colors as an authority, an authoritative figure. A figure, in fact, greater than Moses, and that is exactly what Matthew is hinting. That look here is somebody greater than Moses, in fact, the Son of God. So that is the reason they felt that it was authoritative. Though modern gospel scholarship gives Mark a very prominent place, we know that from the 19th century onward, we have realized that Mark's was the first gospel, and that's how they talk about Markan priority, and from them Luke and Matthew drew their accounts. So though we know that in modern scholarship Mark is held in great esteem. Why? Because it was the primary gospel, the first one. But despite the strain of Markan priority being the bedrock of studies in modern day synoptic studies, we must not forget that Matthew stood first in the great ancient biblical codices and has been the church's gospel par excellence for a reason, because if it is from the Gospel of Matthew, you get the Great Commission towards the end of the Gospel. Go to all the world and make disciples, that Great Commission. And not only because of that, because of, that commissioning of Peter as a rock on which he would build a church. And the most important, the Lord's Prayer. I think it is in the next slide. Because of these pieces, this classical pieces of literature in the Gospel of Matthew is considered to be the Gospel par excellence, the best of all. And that is why it is, held to be the church's primary main Gospel. The Gospel of Matthew has served as the NT's foundational document to the church, rooting it. In fact, It is only in the Gospel of Matthew you will find the word church. Okay, the keys to the kingdom. Now, when Jesus is handing over authority to Peter, he talks about the word church, in Greek ecclesia. In none of the Gospel accounts you find this word ecclesia over there. Okay, so and for this reason it is considered to be the foundational document of the church, because it is the only gospel that brings out the concept of ecclesiology, that is the study of the church, or church built on rock against which the gates of hell would not prevail. This is what Jesus said. Besides that commissioning of Peter, you have the Sermon on the Mount, in which we have those outstanding 8 Beatitudes. Okay, they are considered to be the finest pieces of literature all over the world. In fact, this was something that was highly praised by Mahatma Gandhi when they talk about, the best part of the gospel. This is the thing that is picked out. And of course, the eternal appeal that we have to the Lord's Prayer. You have the Lord's Prayer also in Luke, but that is not the formula that is recited in the church till today. So the Lord's Prayer and the Great Commission at the end of the gospel, these are some very sterling pieces of literature that are, the gems in the Gospel of Matthew, and that is why Matthew was, among all the 4 gospel accounts, was considered to be the most foundational document to the church. Matthew's gospel account is a highly effective narrative. He's narrating, he's telling about the life of Jesus, his teaching, and finally how he dies. So it's a highly effective narrative bearing the hallmarks of the evangelist's, whoever who he was. He must have been a highly trained scribe, highly educated and literate, because he had that also God-given ability to be a very great writer, because not everyone has that skill and the ability to assemble material together and give it a very coherent whole, which Matthew does. So he had that exceptional skill of organization. And to that, he brings to bear upon it his clarity of theological vision, which was very sharp and very deep, and his gift for painting unforgettable images in words which have given this gospel clarity as a church's teaching instrument since antiquity. And we know that the storyline of Matthew is parallel to the Markan storyline, because it was on that he has based. I think we will have to stop here, because the testimony of the fathers, I will take it in the coming session, because there are quite a number of slides and it is a concept which I need to explain to you, without rushing into the matter. So I think I will stop here today.